Hi, welcome to Interabang Chats. I'm Lori Feathers with Interabang Books, and today I'm so happy to have with me Lauren Oyler, whose debut novel, Fake Accounts, will be available at Interabang and all fine independent bookstores starting next Tuesday. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really happy to have you. I've been a fan of your books and social commentary for some time now, so I was really excited to get a chance to read your book and looking forward to talking about it today. Why don't you go ahead and kind of set the stage for us with respect to the book before we dive in?
Sure. So, Fake Accounts takes place right after Trump has won the 2016 election and starts in the sort of heady weeks before he's inaugurated. And the narrator, who is unnamed, has is sort of caught up in the chaotic doomsday moment, and she decides to use this to her advantage and snoops through her boyfriend's phone because she thinks he's been acting weird and she suspects, he's sort of typically cheating on her in some way. It turns out that what he's been doing on his phone is much weirder, and he's been operating a conspiracy theory account on Instagram. And she's sort of like looking at his phone, hunched over on his phone at 3 a.m. while he's sleeping in the bedroom. And she's like, overcome with this excitement at the drama she's inadvertently found. So she decides that she's going to break up with him, and she's sort of happy because she wanted to break up with him anyway. And before she can do that, something happens, which sends her into a kind of tailspin, questioning her life. And she quits her job. She works at a media company in Brooklyn and moves to Berlin, and tries to sort of process not only her relationship, but also the sort of political moment and her life, which takes place primarily online.
So the guy that she is with is his name is Felix. He's an American who's an artist, so to speak, but is right, but it
Yeah.
is working as a tour guide in
Mhm.
Berlin.
Mhm.
And the narrator travels to Berlin and kind of meets up with some foreign tourists, and they decide they're going to do this pub crawl, and he's the tour guide for their pub crawl.
Right.
And so they kind of hook up, and then eventually he ends up, I think about 6 months later, moving to New York City, um, back to the United States. The book is well, first of all, I want to comment on the timeliness of the book
Okay.
because um, wow, what a time for this book to come out. It's about, conspiracy theorists and kind of this nebulous life they live on social media. And then just 3 weeks ago, we had the insurrection on Capitol Hill with a bunch of conspiracy theorists who thought that the election was stolen. So I'm sure you're thinking this is like a really nice, hot time to be talking about this topic.
I mean, it's sort of unfortunate. It's sort of unfortunate to have this, like, I think my worldview is sort of cynical, but I wish that it were different, right? And I think it's sort of sad to find that your cynicism plays out on the international news stage. But I think what sort of fascinated me initially about conspiracy theorists, and what continues to fascinate me as they're in the news, is how many of them actually buy what they're selling, right? So why are you what's your motivation for publishing these things? Do you do it for attention? Does part of you believe it and you just sort of go with that, and you don't allow this sort of conflicting emotions to get in the way of your pursuit of this story? Why do you want to have dedicated followers in this way? And I think that a lot of those questions, because of the way that so many conspiracy theorists act, are sort of unanswerable, right? And you see all these pundits sort of trying to like explain what does QAnon really mean, right? And it doesn't get anyone any closer to sort of stopping it or understanding the individual people who get caught up in it. So that is sort of what I was interested in. And I was also sort of interested in the this the kind of person who seems fairly normal, right? So Felix is a well-educated, pseudo artist, kind of like loafing around in Berlin when the narrator meets him. And he is a pub crawl tour guide for his day job, and is being a sort of painter in his free time. And then eventually he moves back to New York and gets a job working sort of as a social media editor. And I was interested in how this kind of person that we all sort of see as like, oh, normal, he's probably liberal, he probably has more or less the same views that I do, could actually have a very strange alternate life that if you don't pay attention, you'd never know.
So, as I was reading the book, I was imagining how fun it must have been to write this book, because you do a lot of very playful things with the book. And I think it won't be giving too much of the book away to let the readers know that soon after the narrator finds this whole kind of social media conspiracy theory world that her boyfriend Felix is involved in, he has a horrible accident and dies. And she happens to be at the Women's March in Washington, D.C., right after the inauguration of Trump in 2017 at the time. And when he dies, she has all these ambivalent feelings, because she was planning on breaking up with him because he had this double life anyway. And but but he died before she was able to. And she really doesn't know, because it seems so, in one respect, incredulous that he would have be a conspiracy theorist, because he just didn't seem to look the part or act the part. But at the same time, you're playing a lot with this authentic self and authenticity kind of theme throughout the book, because when the narrator goes back to Berlin, she starts playing around with dating apps and going out with all of these guys, and not only lying on her profile on the apps, but she has a different story pretty much for every guy that she goes out with, and none of them are true. And I just thought that that was kind of a really kind of sneaky, snarky way of kind of looking at this, the issue of authenticity, and how even when we're trying to be authentic on social media, we so fall short of being able to do that.
Right. I think she is obviously a sort of terrible, unlikable figure in many ways from the very beginning, and she wants to use the political moment to interpret her personal life in the way that she wants, right? So she is she plans to break up with her boyfriend in this sort of dramatic, very perfect way. She has this really like elaborate idea of constructing their breakup, which is itself quite uh, not a likable thing to do in the first place. And what she gets foiled basically by his sudden death while she is at this humongous historic political event where she's also having sort of ambivalent feelings because it's supposed to be, a real statement of feminism and resistance to Trump. And she's having all these, the actual experience of it is quite overwhelming and a little bit disturbing to be in that big crowd for hours. So I think her sort of cynical reaction to his death and to her kind of personal embarrassment that she can't go through with her plan, and that she has been sort of not called out, but she's forced to think about instead of thinking about the way she was acting, she leans into being a sort of terrible person and sort of says, well, if everybody is around me is going to act is going to play a part and to pretend to be a certain way and not act sort of honestly and vulnerably, then I too can play that game, and perhaps I can play it even better than they can. So she goes on all of these OkCupid dates where she just makes a completely different identity each time, but they're always sort of a little bit banal. Nothing she says is completely unbelievable. It's just sort of like a little bit funny. There's a knowing detail in each persona and things like that. And I was interested in playing with this really heightened emotional political moment and juxtaposing it with this sort of very banal, petty, like insignificant day-to-day life of a young urban woman who is worried more about breaking up with her boyfriend and pretending she can pretend to be anything she wants, and she pretends to be a marketing professional at a startup, or she pretends to be like a low-level architect and things like that.
Or a tax accountant, which
Yes,
is what her employer in Berlin. And actually, her job there is a caretaker for two small twins. So yeah, it doesn't just it's not just a social media aspect, but it bleeds into actual life as well. She is a pretty unlikable character, I agree, but I did have some sympathy for her. And this is another theme that I think that you deal with really well in the book, and she's a lonely person. And there are times when she's trying to where she's actually thinking about all this time that she spends on social media, and even her career at a digital content firm, before she moves to Berlin. She was just constantly like trying to get the most likes or the most follows, and that was her whole existence. But there's a real statement, I think, in the book about how this kind of always being hooked into this kind of facade of connection really just makes us more lonely.
right. And I think that she is constantly, I think she sort of develops her persona project, in part because I think she really wants someone to call her out and to say, like, you're clearly lying. Why are you acting this way? You're being really bizarre and like not even in a particularly exciting way. You're just being really weird. And nobody does. Nobody notices, or if they do notice, I think there are some characters, particularly the woman that she babysits for, that may notice, but they just don't. It's nothing. It doesn't bother them. And so I think that really reflects my current and particularly my past experiences on social media, where I would just be constantly watching people do things that were just so, self-preservational, but also so self-centered, but also so kind of mean, and doing all this stuff in public for, vague reasons. And it becomes very sad because to be able to see all of this happening all at once all the time, and nobody seems to learn from their mistakes. Nobody seems to say, like, oh, maybe we should do something very basic and treat others the way that we'd like to be treated. There's always a constant churn of people making these sort of like cruel mistakes online. And I think what I was hoping to do is to show that not only is that true, that happens, but also it's not any different from what happens in real life, right? I think people act. You can sort of see the very classical elements of an old school plot or an old school novel in the social dynamics on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And there's, betrayals and people getting upset, personally offended about tiny little slights against them and having grudges. And you can sort of chart who's friends with who and who stops being friends with who. And it just feels very, what?
Misunderstandings for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
misunderstanding. Someone interprets something as an insult when actually it's a compliment, or someone says something ambiguous in order to sort of like play both sides. It's just very sordid and sort of bleak. So yes, I think that she is very lonely and very sad because she should have, you know, ostensibly she has tons of people around her, right? She's not actually, technically lonely. She has access to, and theoretically anyone.
Right. Would you like your book, your novel, to be considered kind of as an indictment of social media and our social media culture?
I think that that's fair. I think that it's not exclusive to social media. Like if tomorrow all social media companies were shut down, I think that people would still act this way. But we wouldn't have to see it be rewarded so often, right? Which maybe would help in some way, I think. But
Yeah.
I don't I don't know what you I firmly believe that you can't say to people just be nice and kind to one another, because some people will listen to you, but other people will continue to go through these cycles.
Yeah, but I think that there definitely is something to be said about how it almost forgives our carelessness or rudeness, because so much of life, real life, not social media life, is trying to like build connections and understandings with people, and we're just allowed through social media, I think, to have these kind of false friends, false followers, and play this game about how prominent we can be without really having any kind of real connection.
Yeah, and I think what's so disappointing about it, and this is my fault for sort of buying into the company's slogans about connection and things like that, but it seems to promise a real shortcut to intimacy and a shortcut to relationships that inherently can have no shortcut. I think that intimacy is sort of can only be built over time, and not just through sort of declaring yourself to another person and then have them declaring themselves to you, and then you both sort of accept what they're saying about you, right? Each other. The a real intimacy is built on mutual interpretation and mutual exchange, and that is just not what happens. That's just not what happens online.
Right, for
And
sure.
there's so little trust also, for good reason, there, that it's makes existing in any way beyond the way that people act. The reason why people act the way that they do online is because it's inherently paranoid and it's inherently distrustful, and it cultivates those things, and that also cultivates a sort of social media addiction where you need to be looking at the computer because something is going to happen and it could involve you in some way.
Or you will have a missed opportunity if you're not responding within the first 2 seconds of it popping up.
Right.
One of the other things that your book is critical of is I think, the current trends or the current state of the American novel. And I loved the whole critique about the fragmentary novel. And then you're kind of, in a metafictional kind of way, doing 40 pages of fragmentary novel. So as a book reviewer, tell me tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are about where the novel's going.
Well, I think I have some more sort of optimism than I did when I was writing this book, which I wrote between maybe 2017 and 2018. Um, but I think I really felt at the time, and still sort of feel, that it needed like a shot in the arm, to use an appropriate metaphor for the time. And I think that, for good reason, and this relates to the social media conversation as well, writers are often quite scared to take a risk. And not saying that I'm a brave, I don't want to say that I'm brave or anything, but when you're criticizing someone, you open yourself up to criticism in return, I think. And I understand why everybody is sort of hesitant to criticize each other, because it's this, I'll scratch you, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of culture. And social media, I think, heightens that. Of course, it's not, it's nothing new, but I think a fear of being not just like getting a bad review, which is sort of par for the course and a storied tradition, but being made fun of unfairly online is a real deterrent to doing a lot of things, which is a long-winded way to say that I think that there are a lot of uh, passionate readers in the United States, and I think that they have been underserved by novels that take place now and comment on what's happening now.
Yeah. Um, One of the things that I thought was also very interesting, because it seems like every day that passes, I meet more people that have this view. But the narrator meets a young American woman in Berlin. Her name is, I think, is Nell.
Mhm.
And one time they're having a discussion. I think they're workshopping, because
Okay.
they're both writers. And Nell says, "Well, I've just stopped. I've just stopped consuming news. I don't read news. I don't watch news. And in my personal life, I've run across more and more people, and especially people that are younger than myself, that have kind of just decided that, I don't know whether they think there's something like pure in not participating in the news or current events, but they've just decided to unplug. Maybe it's too stressful. I don't know. Um, but I think that there's a certain amount of complacency in that kind of attitude, that you're just going to opt out of all news. It's kind of lazy, because you're then just kind of saying, I give up trying to kind of figure out what's real news and what's fake news. And I kind of thought about that in perspective of this discussion that Nell and the narrator have. It's a really kind of hard time in the whole world, the last few years, and this kind of tendency, and maybe it's because of social media overload a little bit, that you just decide that, I'm not going to pay attention to what's going on around me or in the world, or I'm just going to kind of be an ostrich about it. And I wondered whether or not, um, you kind of thought about this kind of opting out of society or the world at large when you were writing the book.
Oh yeah, I mean, did I think about it personally? I think about it personally all the time when I want to do it. I think it's a totally understandable fantasy, and also I think the narrator in the book, and I shared this view, says when her friend is telling her that she doesn't read the news anymore. I don't need to see that stuff. If something really bad happens, someone will tell me. And the narrator is quite sympathetic, and she's like, actually, she's not wrong. What good is forces, what good is being done by her being aware? And I think one of the sort of overarching themes of the novel is, or questions that I wanted to ask, is what is the purpose of awareness, and what are we cultivating when we are consuming so much knowledge all the time and trying to sort of circumvent the progress of events by having this sort of air of knowingness or superiority. So throughout the book, I think the narrator is constantly trying to sort of best the reader by saying, I know what you're thinking. I know that this seems bad because of this and this and this, and I know all these things. But in the end, she still, not to give it away, but she gets fooled,
Yes.
and she gets totally duped. And I think her interaction with that friend is sort of chance for her to come up against this kind of realization where she's being quite dismissive of the friend's attitude about not consuming the news, but also has to admit that, you know, she kind of she kind of has a point, because we live in this sort of, she and the friend are expats in Berlin, and they live in an extremely sort of close knit, like insular community where life is pretty good. And I, you know, living in New York, working in the media, again, you're pretty insulated from the real consequences of the news, and life is pretty good. And I think we see a lot of novelists now trying to grapple with that, and sort of having this sort of guilty reckoning with the fact that of their privilege, and they live in Brooklyn and they have a nice apartment and they sit around writing their little novel all day. And meanwhile, people are dying. And I think that it's very important to acknowledge not only that that's true, but also that feeling guilty and sort of trying to patch over that truth with, you know, awareness also has really no tangible effect on the world, except maybe you're voting in a more in a more educated way, which is not nothing, but it's a vote is not a nuanced statement, right? A vote is a very straightforward statement.
One of the things that I loved most about the book was just this really close feeling of the neighborhoods in Berlin that I think that you evoked really well. And so tell me about your experience in Berlin. You've lived part of your adulthood there?
Yeah, I moved there right after I graduated from college, and I lived there for about 2.5 years. They have this really good, what this is represented in the book, really good sort of freelance artist visa that I took advantage of, and in the same sort of like, I feel like I'm getting away with something by just being able to sort of waltz into this country and apply for this visa, and then I get to live here without having to say very much for myself. And I think it's super interesting. I think the expat population is super interesting as sort of cordoned off community in Berlin, that, to my knowledge, has not gotten a ton of attention in novels. And there's always, when I lived there, and I lived there for 2.5 years, and then I go back. Ordinarily, I would be going back twice a year, but not right now, obviously. But there are always these debates and these sort of like bitter arguments about who's a real Berliner and like who's a real expat, and your German's not good enough, so you're faking it. And I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition with all these sort of social media liars and fakers that populate the novel, and that the narrator is one too. And she's sort of confronted with her pose in a completely different way by moving to Berlin, because, you know, if you've ever spent time in a foreign country and you don't speak the language, you're really like suddenly quite helpless in a lot of ways, and it's super embarrassing. You feel very public, even though, you know, nobody cares if you mess up, you know, a word or you can't, you know, if you struggle. People are used to seeing tourists all the time, but it's a deeply sort of humiliating and personal experience. And I was interested in sort of making her go through that when she's so resistant to being embarrassed in the rest of her life.
She had resisted for quite a long time,
Yeah.
language, which is kind of interesting. Granted, she's dealing with expats a lot in her social life and all of these kind of fake dates that she goes on, but I mean, there are many situations where it's clear that she's not getting along as well as she could have if she would have just like decided to learn the language a little bit.
Yes, and I mean, this is like, if anybody, I don't know if have you been to Berlin?
I have not been to Berlin. I've been to lots of places in Eastern Europe, but not Berlin.
So it's very, you don't have to speak German to get around there. People live there for years and years and cannot even really order a beer in German, which is bad because it's the same word in English. And because so many Germans speak great English, and the expat community is so large, and English is just the sort of functioning how you get around in many sort of business capacities. So she doesn't have to, but there's this constant like everybody knows that you should, right? Because you can't go to a movie, you can't go to all the movies, right? That's a very sort of casual relaxation thing, but you can't. It's very taxing to feel nervous every time you go to a restaurant because you aren't totally, you're not sure if you're doing it exactly right. And so, but also even her German roommate, and this is, I'm comfortable saying this is taken directly from my experience with a German roommate. Her German roommate's like, why would you learn German? Like,
Right.
you don't need to. And so her fears about being like an authentic, person in Germany are very easily punctured by this, straight talking, quite fun German woman who's like, English is better.
Why would you do that? Right.
Why are you so freaked out about this?
Until she has to fill out that horrible health insurance form, which that sounded that there was so much wonderful detail in that. I have to think that that was maybe an experience that you went through or knew someone who did.
Oh, yeah. And I did not fill out that particular health insurance form, but I remain on the Berlin expat panelist. So anytime something new happens with health insurance in Germany, I am aware. And I mean, because the narrator sort of messes up and prints out the wrong form and like can't navigate the website, it was very easy to research things like that because I was just like, this website is completely confusing. I don't understand it. So of course this character is also not going to understand it. But she also doesn't, I mean, maybe this goes back to the point about the book being quite sad and lonely. She lives with a German person and she doesn't even think to ask her to help her.
Right.
And so it takes her, she has this sort of anxiety about filling out the health insurance form for weeks and weeks and weeks when she could have just done it, in 5 minutes.
So I don't know when you finished writing your close to final draft of the novel, but I'm sure you probably never expected that your first book was going to come out in such a crappy time in the world with COVID and the inability to do author tours. And I'm just kind of wanted to ask how that's going for you and kind of how difficult it's been.
I mean, I think because I've never done it any other way, it's probably not as difficult for me as it would be for someone who is used to being able to like talk to readers and sign books in person and do all the fun stuff. And I mean, I truly was looking forward to doing that stuff. But I think it's appropriate in a certain way to have to do everything online, right? and it's very stressful that you sort of feel even more than usual that the entire chance that the book has is like in your computer, on Twitter, on Instagram, these things that you hate that cause you so much strife, and you're like, but I need you. This is what I've been wasting my life on for years that I can finally cash in. And then you're like, oh no. Because also everybody, of course, is so sick of being on the computer and in their house. And I would completely understand not wanting to read a book about how terrible it is to be stuck on your computer for all the time.
So do you have another book in your sights?
I mean, I loved writing the book. I think I like a long word count. So I do, but it's very early stages.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great.
It was really a pleasure to talk to you, and I really look forward to putting fake accounts into some readers' hands at the store. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.